Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Marnese Live Talk Show. I'm your host, Marnese Jackson, and tonight we will talk about anti-Blackness and how it shows up in other cultures and within the Black community. Tonight we have a round of good guests, wonderful guests, phenomenal guests. We have Maruba, Stephanie, Crystal, Amari, Antonio, Ian, and Suwaitha to talk to us about what anti-Blackness is and how it shows up. So let's welcome them into the Marnese Live Talk Show. Welcome, 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 welcome to the Marnese Live Talk Show. How you doing?
Good.
Good.
That's doing all right as well on this end.
That's good. That's good to hear. So we're streaming live on Facebook. So welcome, Amari. Anthony just left us, but I know he's gonna come back. Suwaitha, Crystal, Ian, Stephanie, Maruba. So welcome. So I know that we want to get right into the discussion. So let's get into it. First of all, before we go there, let's all take a breather, right? Because it's been a long 2 weeks around anti-Blackness. Okay, so let's just breathe, okay? And could you all just tell me one word, how are you feeling right now? Let's start with you, Anthony. You look like you're ready. Antonio, you look like you're ready to go.
I'm sweaty.
Sweaty? All right. You look like you've been working. All right, who's next? How you feeling, Ian?
Just feeling my heartbeat, which is good, I guess, but you're still kicking.
Anxious.
Crystal?
So I think the word for me, the word for the week has been activate.
Okay.
I feel activated. Let's
What
go.
What about you, Stephanie?
I'd say ready.
Ready?
I've been waiting for this.
All right. So wait, how you doing over there?
Hi, Marnese. I'm feeling tired but inspired.
She gave me 2 words. What about you, Amari? How you doing?
Empowered.
Empowered. All right, that's good. I'm happy. So before we go on to this discussion, can each one of you tell me, so we can tell our viewers, what do you identify as, meaning racial and gender? So everybody can know who we're talking to. So I'll start off with Crystal.
Yeah. So I'm Chris Campbell. I'm an African-American woman. I'm a Black woman. The way I personally identify, though, is a member of the African diaspora. My girlfriend, Shonda Scott, coined this phrase, African diasporan. So I'm an African diasporan. Oh, and gender-wise, I'm cisgender. I present the way that I identify.
Okay. All right. So wait,
Hey everyone, I'm Suwaitha. I use she, her pronouns. I am South Asian, but I'm from the Tamil ethnic community in South Asia, so I identify as Tamil for lots of reasons, but I'll get back to you, Marnese.
Okay, we're gonna talk more about that because I'm not for sure I know what that is. So we're gonna get more into that, Suwaitha. All right, I'm gonna be like this. I'm gonna have my ladies go first. Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I identify as Black. I'm biracial, but I was raised by my Black mother, and all my family and all my brothers are Black men. And I identify as cisgender, woman. And did you ask where you're from or no?
Oh, well, you can tell us where you're from.
Yeah. I'm originally from Kansas City, Kansas. So
Okay.
Like Janelle Monáe.
Maruba, tell us more about you.
Hi everyone, my name is Maruba Akhtar. I'm from Bangladesh, a South Asian woman. I identify as she, hers, and thank you, Marnese, for inviting me to this.
All right. So if you don't identify as a lady, a woman, we can go next to our gentleman. You can get it right in there. So I want to make sure I respect everybody's pronouns and what they identify as. So Ian, would you like to go next?
All right, I'm going to start with the easiest stuff first. So to go by he, him pronouns, and if we get, depending on how much conversation time talk about,
You got an hour.
All right, yeah, we can speak a little more. So as far as identity, Southeast Asian or Vietnamese, South Vietnamese American diaspora. And then further, if we look back, I could say a little bit about Pan-Asian as well, just looking at heritage. And then, in terms of gender identity also, I could challenge binary constructs as well, but we're okay for now. Yeah.
All right, Amari. All right.
Hi everybody. I'm a black man, cisgender, he and him. As far as my my race goes, it kind of goes all over the place. I primarily identify as a black and indigenous man, but I also have Japanese and Arabic roots.
Okay. All right, and Antonio, last but not least, I wanted you to give you time because you said you were sweaty, so I wanted to give you time to cool off.
Yeah, I've got my water right here, water bottle with me, ready to go.
All right.
I am a Chicano Boricua. So I like indigenous. I have African ancestry. I have South European ancestry. So pretty mixed.
All right.
But I don't like ID as mixed.
Okay. Crystal, did you know that Antonio went to Eastern too?
Where? We'll have to have that conversation later.
Oh, sick. Yeah, I heard you started PS.
He was.
I was a member of the original group of PS.
Okay, respect.
All right, let's get into the conversation. I just had to do that because there's no place like EMU, guys. So, all right, so I would like to start with my Black African identifying brothers and sisters. How do you feel about anti-Blackness? Hey, don't be so. I know we got shy.
You threw that question out there like it was gonna be a.
Right, like it was easy, like it was a lighthearted question. What do you want for lunch?
Anti-Blackness. I'll tell you how I feel about anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is anti-human, especially if you know the origin of humanity, know the history of humankind. Anti-Blackness is anti-self for anyone because of the lineages that were derived from African ancestry. But I think the most important thing about it is it's a tactic that is used to keep people who are strong and powerful under a system that works against us constantly, day in, day out. So it's actually, in my opinion, a demonic force, but it's also a very, it's just, I'm just leave it there because I think after you say demonic force, there's really not much more I can say after that.
Right.
Can
I lay on top of that? In terms of him saying that it's a demonic force, I was just thinking when the question was raised, like, does anti-Blackness have a consciousness? Because I don't think there's an individual, with the exception of extreme white supremacists, who would say or admit that they're anti-Black. Like, no one wants to admit that they're anti-Black. And so that means that it must be a force or a system. And then I wonder, does this force or system have a consciousness? Like, does it have an intent? But my original answer and what I planned to say when I came here was anti-Blackness is not my problem. Anti-Blackness is the problem of those who have a problem with Blackness, right?
All
But
right.
when you think of it in terms of the spiritual realm as opposed to the physical realm, then you have to say, then yes, it is a demonic force. And then, yes, it must have a consciousness and it must have an intent, in which case it does affect me and it is my problem.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Okay. Stephanie, what do you think, hon?
How I feel about anti-Blackness is I believe it's the root cause of a lot of the problems that we have, not just in this country, but all over the world globally. I do agree about it being a tool. I think it's actually one of the worst tools that has been used to control history, land, resources, people, and it's rooted in pride and the idea that we as humans can decide the value in another human's existence. But how I feel about it emotionally is I hate it. I wake up every day wanting to undo this anti-Blackness that's woven into everything. So yeah, that's how I feel.
All right, Antonio, Sawika, Haruka, Ian, would you like to speak on this?
Yeah, I'll say I think there are a couple layers that I look at it from, especially as someone who, at least from a community that doesn't necessarily recognize how it functions and is at play. So on one hand, from a U.S. point of view, there's sort of the realities that and stories and experiences that a lot of folks live firsthand and can directly connect with. But also, from maybe a colorism point of view as well, that there's a dynamic of Blackness. So, for example, in possibly in South Asia as well, but definitely in Southeast Asia and East Asia, just depending on how dark your skin color is, that's associated with certain kinds of discrimination that doesn't have anything to do with Western colonial notions. That's its own issue. And so, on the whole, there's that's a different angle. We're almost describing like a characteristic or a feature. And then also when it comes to recognizing Blackness as a form of identity and story, that not story, but experience where I guess I bring into question the framing as far as the language that we're using when it comes to defining Black and how people connect with it or come to understand those experiences as well. So I could go on a little more, but I think that covers the seed of it.
So I'd like to bring Sawika and Maruba before I get into asking you about how does it show up in your community. So
yeah, thank you, Marnese, and thanks for everyone for all your thoughtful answers. And I definitely agree with what all of y'all had to say in terms of anti-Blackness being a tool. It is definitely a tool that is used by folks who are in control of all the systems that control us. For example, capitalism. It has definitely benefited off of anti-Blackness. And it's also a tool that divides communities and that non-Black communities benefit from. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But Ian, I do want to say colorism is definitely taking on aspects of anti-Blackness, and it's definitely very pervasive in the South Asian community. And a lot of that you can be seen with like the difference between, well, I'm from subcontinent of India, so you can see the difference between like North Indians who are light skinned and like South Indians and Tamil people where I'm from experiencing similar things to anti-Blackness within India.
thank you, Sawika. Aruba.
I'm going to add to what Ian and Swetha already mentioned. Anti-Blackness is very much so ingrained in not so much from the cultural standpoint, like anti-Black as an identity, but more so a feature, right? A skin color. And it's a very American characteristic, I want to say, to be anti-Black, because in Bangladesh, I can tell you, nobody just explicitly sees a Black person and goes, I hate you because you're Black. It's more of those colonialist features that's really sought after, right? Aspiring to look like their colonizers, because that's what success looks like to them, because that's what success was, held up as a standard. That's what was held as a standard of success. So we can delve into that. There's a lot more to add on.
And Antonio, what do you think?
So I've been kind of thinking quite a bit about, is it like a uniquely American phenomenon? I don't think so. I think like it exists outside. I think a lot of like the countries, communities adjacent to Africa, and then certainly like the African diaspora that's made it out of Africa and migrated to various communities over time. I think anti-Blackness kind of tends to be in and around those places. But I also think there's something that is very unique about the United States that applies to other settler colonies around the world, which is just like the racialization, which is Black and white. And I think like every country in the world, every nation state maintains its own version of a racialization. In the United States, in Mexico, in Canada, in Israel, in South Africa, in Australia, New Zealand, we tend to have this racialization and this hierarchy of ethno belonging tends to be white and Black. And it's this extreme polarity within the United States, to the point that like when a new migrant community comes to the United States, you have to shit on the lowest, realm. It's like buying into the club of Americanness for Irish people involved becoming cops, despite them being like oppressed or whatever for a number of years. For the new immigrant communities, Latino people, it's like, yeah, distancing yourself from Blackness is like a major trend in like becoming more American. So there is an aspect that's uniquely American within like the Black and whiteness, but it's also, it like reverberates out into settler colonies, but then also like I think like anti-Blackness as a system has existed in and around African diasporic communities since probably time immemorial. But I don't know.
Crystal, did you want to jump in there? It looked like you had a thought.
Well, when he talked about how it pervades colonies, I was thinking about Blumenbach and Blumenbach's typography, and how before Blumenbach, and probably like, I don't know, the late 1600s, was the first to identify races and then put them in a stratus. He was the first to say, okay, Europeans are here, and then Asians and Indians are here, and then Africans are down at the bottom, right? And so I think in terms of biology, there were other biologists and other scientists who would describe people from various continents, but he was the first one to assign value. And so it's interesting when we think about manifest destiny, when we look at colonialism and the way that it's reached so far across the globe, how it can all be traced back to this typography, and how Blumenbach was the first to say, okay, Europeans are at the top and we're the most, and it was purely based on attractiveness, like purely based on who he thought was most attractive. And that the tentacles have stretched so far, and it's been woven into so many systems just based on this one German dude's perception of what was attractive and not attractive. Like, that's just wild to me. And that's what I thought about when Antonio was speaking.
Yeah, now that you have closer proximity to whiteness, you have greater value. And so now it's like woven and mutated in every structural, institutional, oppressive form in our life, from testing, tracking, voter suppression, discrimination laws, and so on. So I wanted to bring it down though to the community and family and friends level. Where do you see anti-Blackness manifesting and perpetuating or showing up in your lives? The workplace, activism spaces, family, friends, your community. What does that look like? And I want to ask Ian, what does that look like on your end?
Yeah, I think when a lot of, especially among advocate circles, there's a more explicit definition or understanding of racism, for example, right? Where often you'll hear something about it's a system that benefits a certain dominant group. And when it comes to what we see, I think often it's stuff that's baked into the day to day. So why is it so hard to get certain things filed or whatever else, getting justice in terms of going through the legal proceedings, things like that, or even in terms of academia, and when it comes to certain kinds of understanding where we might be looking at just the origins of traditional medicine, for example, and trying to validate that, or even psychology and personal experiences, mental health, and looking at things from an intergenerational level or from a cultural lens that isn't going to fit in the DSM-5 box. These are all institutions that have been baked from a very deep place. Even the notion of anthropology and ethnography, those were disciplines that were developed as ways to distinguish different cultures and sort of justify racism and other forms of exploitation. So in the day-to-day life, it kind of, for me at least, it depends on one, your capacity to like articulate what's what you're feeling and seeing. And then also on a very practical level for the day-to-day is when people maybe talk a certain way and it silences others, in terms of like protesting.
Specifically though, how is it showing up in your community that you identify as? How is that showing up? What have you specifically seen?
Oh, well, I mean, on one end, there's there are derogatory terms for Black people, for example, and it's that exists, and it's unfortunate that that's something that I, even within family, that's there. And so having to educate in that way or call it out is probably the most immediate. It's weird for me because I'm first generation US refugee family, kind of, and in a place where there aren't that many Vietnamese people around me. So if I'm living in Detroit, then the community is typically around 82, maybe more % Black. And looking at anti-Blackness from that lens, it's again, I look at it kind of from the systems, or like just the way the city operates, or gentrification, or public hearings, meetings, things like that, and how challenging it is for people who might not even have time to get out of work to attend like the police board of commissioners meeting today at 3 p.m. And kind of articulate things that they have issues with, and hold the police accountable for things that are concerns or priorities for the community.
All right. So wait, what about you?
Thanks, Marnese. So I would say it shows up in a lot of places. Definitely shows up in organizing spaces, especially in the climate space, as Marnese, you are very well aware. I think I'm a climate organizer, just a background for some of you, and it's like very pervasive in the way that some organizations work on their issues in terms of organizing, in terms of ignoring racism and ignoring environmental racism. It shows up in terms of, for example, a couple weeks ago, I was on a coalition call and no one wanted to talk about George Floyd, and no one wanted to talk about state-sanctioned violence against Black folks.
Which coalition is this? You can inbox me and I'll call them out.
Right. And then someone brought it up. I'm pretty sure a Black woman brought it up, and they were like, all right, let's save it for 5 minutes at the end. So it's like things like that, definitely pervasive in the South Asian community, in so many ways, particularly in the ways that the South Asian community wants to distance themselves from the Black community, by saying like, oh, I'm not Black, I'm South Asian, or by using like the N-word to each other, even though they're not Black. And I could go on and on, but I'll leave it at that.
All right.
Let's leave your Blackness for the last 5 minutes of the meeting.
Wow. Okay. Aruba, let's talk about you. What have been some of your experiences?
So it's very interesting because there is a pretty big population of Bangladeshis here in Detroit and Hamtramck area, right? I think we have, the third or fourth largest Bangladeshi population in the U.S. And so living here, I've learned and I've kind of seen how Bangladeshis interact with the Black community. I think a lot of the stereotypes that the Bangladeshi community holds for the Black community comes from what they see on TV. Whether or not they've actually interacted with Black people, there's no connection, right? I remember one of my dad's, so I came to the US when I was 2 years old. But growing up, I remember my dad would always say, he would say really bigoted things about the Black community. And reflecting on that stuff as I got older, it was very uncomfortable, right? But those were kind of discomforts I had to learn to address. Like why is it that my dad had this perception of the Black community? Where did this come from? And it literally came from seeing, from over policing, seeing people on TV. Every time there was a mugshot, it was a Black man, and it took a long time for me, myself, being a South Asian woman, to understand that what I was taught from a young age, right? The stereotypes that were associated with Blackness, I had to unlearn them. And not only did I have to unlearn them, I had to teach my family how to unlearn them. And they were very uncomfortable conversations. They weren't fun discussions because there's a lot of pushback, but we've seen this, and we saw this on TV. This is what the reports are saying, and everybody believes what they see on the media. So that's kind of how it shows in the South Asian community. I'd like to think most of the South Asian community molds their perception of the Black community based off entirely what they see on TV, not even personal interactions. And yeah, that's just the unfortunate reality of it.
Thank you. Antonio, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I see anti-Blackness play out in movement spaces. Sometimes through it's like infantilizing, like tokenization of like Black voices on boards, or representation of like people who aren't necessarily like able to like best articulate for an X, Y, and Z community, but is there because they're not going to stir up trouble. That's something you see within like the nonprofit structure quite a bit. Another thing that I think is really problematic that I've been sitting here thinking about and kind of jotting down ideas around is so much of the environmental movement. I'm also engaged in the environmental conservation, justice, farming, a lot of stuff in Detroit, colonization, is the way that like Black suffering is kind of like used to raise money by a lot of different people. That's another way I see it like utilized in anti-Blackness, like play out in social spaces. I think there's a lot of micro shit that happens all the time where like somebody's like a Black person's like opinion isn't necessarily respected or like trumpeted, and somebody will just say the same thing with like perhaps better diction or better whatever like vocabulary, get like like uplifted. That happens a lot. Yeah, and I think like a lot of movement spaces these days, like late stage capitalism, so much of the wealth, of the concentrated wealth that exists in our economy has gone into foundations, which has gone into funding the nonprofit industrial complex. And that's like usually like white middle class people who occupy those positions and jobs. So like they bring a lot of like anti-Black attitudes, like weird, like authoritarian, like there's a lot of weird shit that happens within the nonprofit industrial complex around nonprofit leadership and like, yeah, I don't know. Those are just a couple thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for that. I thought I was the only one who thought that, but thanks so much for lifting that up. Stop smiling, Stephanie. All right, so I'm gonna go to my Black brothers and sisters. How has anti-Blackness shown up in our community? We know that we have a history of oppression, right? So what have you seen as of lately? Or is it the same old story?
So can I jump in because I don't see anybody else that's eager. I think the ways that I see it show up are very practical, like very day by day ways. I have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. And so for me, anti-Blackness shows up in the television shows they watch when all the bad guys are darker than the good guys, right? It shows up in like preschool where my daughter has friends who don't necessarily want to be friends because she's the only brown girl or dark brown girl in her class, right? It shows up in the fact that I work in government, and there are lots of Black folks that work in government, but I could not point out a dark-skinned African American or otherwise that works in my immediate proximity. I think it shows up in that the expectation of behavior for people that do happen to be dark skinned working, thinking about a previous job in government, we expect them to be loud and belligerent and ghetto and to be the comic relief in the room, right? And so that anyone else that approaches that even looks similarly to them or appears to be similar to them, we expect that same thing, or they expect that same thing from them. And so I just see it as a devaluing, and I see it show up daily. Like even my grocery store, I can take you to my Kroger and not see brown people or dark-skinned brown people on the front end at the grocery store. Like very practical, everyday places where someone made a decision. I've even seen paperwork at a job where they were specifically looking for a multiracial individual or racially ambiguous individual for a role that was going to be very publicly prominent and would be dealing with issues that were very controversial. Okay. And it's written, someone wrote this in their notes. I don't think they expected anyone to see the notes, but we saw them and we discussed them and we were disgusted by it. And so I see it show up every day in very, very mundane ways, in very mundane places, which just tells me how ingrained it is.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And I love those examples. I love them, but I don't like them. Let me be clear. Stephanie and Omari.
So for me, I would definitely say that anti-Blackness shows up in my family. I'm biracial, but I identify as Black. The only people who were in my life were Black people. All my brothers are Black men. I'm the only one that's half white. And I recently, in the last 2 years, first interacted with my white side of my family. And I found out they were like Trump supporters. And everything I wake up and have fought for the past 15 years, they are for my very existence. So that's like one aspect to how anti-Blackness shows up. But then like my mother being a Black woman, not being ambiguous, I've always experienced people treat her differently. And then me as a child, not knowing what privilege was, being forced in a place to use my privilege to like advocate for my mother. And that's still going on like right now. Like she can go into the exact same grocery store I go into and will be treated differently than I would.
So do you see that coming from whites, or do you see that you have issues with Black people treating you differently because your mother is Black? Tell us more.
Yeah. So I would say the opposite side of Chris's story is like I've had hiring situations where by Black women, I'm not Black enough, right? But they don't know my lived experience. They just see me and they make assumptions, not knowing like the person who kissed me at the end of each night was a Black woman, right? So I often find it interesting that like when we think of anti-Blackness, it's often folks who are in between. Like I may look ambiguous, but how I identify, how I show up in spaces is Black, but it's questioned. I have to prove it. Like I have to pull like a Black card out and be like, yes, here I am, this is what I am. Which makes it complicated in building relationships with girlfriends. But yeah, that's like how anti-Blackness shows up in my life.
All right, Omari.
Right now, anti-Blackness is showing up as pollen that is causing me to have major allergy issues. So bear with me.
Sorry, Amari, you want me to come back to you?
Was that?
Do you want me to come back to you? I am.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
I think one thing I want to talk about specifically is what I call black tax, and redlining is included in that, right? So what we commonly don't pay attention to, and I don't mean everybody when I say that, but what's commonly not discussed is how expensive it is to be black in a country like this. All the extra expenses, the extra tickets we get for being pulled over while driving black, the cost we pay for insurance, like in Detroit, the highest insurance in the world per capita, which is calculated based on a redlining model that's old. So if you live near Grosse Pointe, but in Detroit, and you have a white family, you're a black family, and you're a white family in Grosse Pointe, same statistics, same income, same level of education, so on and so forth. The black family is paying $5,000 to $7,000 a year in insurance, and then you go right across the street, and the family that's living there is paying significantly less in auto insurance, which means that they don't have equal income. It looks like they have equal income on paper, but because you're being taxed for your blackness and your location in proximity to other people who are black, you are paying extra price to live.
Right.
Cable rates higher, Detroit water rates higher. Our customers from the 172 municipalities that Detroit serves pay less in water than we do. They add their city services in with theirs, so their bills look bigger, but they pay less for our water than we do. System we built, system we own, so on and so forth. And that's been going on for years. I can go on about the anti-blackness. I don't want to belabor and take up too much time, but when I think about the black tax, I think about how much that impacts us. Extra stuff that we get charged for in the emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
Extra stuff we get charged for at our local grocery stores, higher prices for outdated food, things like that. So I think that's a major economic hit that we take. And our biggest issue in political empowerment is a lack of economic empowerment.
Facts. And also to that point, you have the economic injustice, then you have the food injustice because they're not getting quality food for, outdated and not quality food. So I wanted to go back to Ian, Swetha, and Maruba about complicit in colorblindness and how I don't want to group everyone together, but for because I know the Asian community is not a monolithic group. I get that, okay? But there is the model minority myth. And we see as Black people a lot of anti-Blackness within the minority, within the Asian community as a whole, like not showing up for us. And an example that I can give that's current was the murder of George Floyd, right? And one of the cops was from the Asian community. Like I said, I'm not trying to group everybody together, but he was right there and he could have intervened. And so we noticed that a lot of Asians don't want to speak up for us because, to be quite honest, your communities are all advancing over here in America economically. And so I wanted to see your thoughts on Asians being complicit in anti-Blackness.
So I can go first and speak to this a little bit. So one thing that I've noticed, so the model minority myth is just that, it's a myth, right? It basically perpetuates the stereotype that all Asians are doing well, and that's not the case at all. Just for a little bit of background, it started when we had immigration policy changes in the US in the 1960s, which allowed only very educated and learned Asians with very specific skill sets, a very special visa to come into the US. You know, obviously, if you're bringing in more educated folks, a larger part of their population is going to be educated and making more money due to that education. And so right off the bat, that's where the statistics were very skewed. So my father being one of these examples, he came here on that HB1 visa, right? He had an engineering degree, but once he got here, that degree really wasn't worth anything. And so my dad had to drive a cab to make ends meet, you know, and we were living paycheck to paycheck. And so what happens is a lot of times Asians don't really want to address the fact that they're not all doing well, you know, they're not all doing financially well, but they want to uphold that stereotype that all Asians are doing well and they are all successful. And so at times what happens is they feel they would be exposed if they speak up about this. They don't want to, it's a little bit of pride, right? They don't want to admit that they're not doing as well as they think they are. And there's a lot of falling complicit to these pressures, I guess, of these stereotypes of being successful. A lot of times they just don't speak up. They just want to uphold the status quo. They want to uphold this myth that's out there that all Asians are, you know, this perfect minority group. They're successful. They're making a lot of money. You know, they're ideal neighbors. I actually had an instance where we moved next door to a Polish family, and they legitimately said to my parents, we'd rather have you as neighbors than some other folks. And we knew exactly what they were talking about, obviously. And so a lot of times I think Asian people are used as a buffer between the white community and the Black community. And that's not something to be proud about. But I think a lot of Asians take that as a point of pride. Another thing I've seen is the migration of Asians who might start in Detroit or Hamtramck and then progress to the suburbs, and not so much because they cared to live in the suburbs, but the suburbs is seen as a standard of success, right? It's just been really interesting to see, and that's kind of how I've seen it show up in the Asian community. It's very unfortunate, but I'll let Ian and Swetha add to this.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And yeah, I definitely resonate with a lot of what you were saying. And I also want to say it was a tool invented to uphold white supremacy. And it obviously is still working to divide our communities so that we don't show up for each other and we don't work towards collective liberation. And just to add to the history that Maruba talked about, it was shown that sort of South Asians or Asians in general only started to make it economically after it was deemed like politically convenient for the US to have like an allyship with Japan and China. So it's just like it was definitely like all created to uphold like what like the colonial US colonial white supremacist system that we live in. And in addition to that, for South Asian, it also like really shows up in caste. So when South Asians were first migrating here, upper caste folks from North India wanted to latch onto their proximity to whiteness and sort of wanted to be classified as white. And a few folks that did try to contrast themselves with lower caste folks and South Indians who they compared to Black people. So I think that's sort of what I wanted to highlight, and how it's definitely very pervasive, and it is a myth. And I agree with what Maruba was saying in terms of just like saving face and not actually recognizing the struggles that we are all going through, and wanting to distance yourself as to make it seem to the outside world like this myth is true.
Thank you, Swetha. And after Ian goes, I have a question in the chat for you three. Okay.
So yeah, I would say that even within the Southeast and East Asian, so some of the other pieces of my heritage is also Japanese and Chinese. And when it comes to being in the U.S., there's some very different numbers between Vietnamese high school attainment, which I think it's like somewhere around I want to say 21% for people who were born in the U.S. versus other groups. And then also like for the Hmong community, Hmong are the like that officer that was in kind of standing by complicit in George Floyd's murder. They're an indigenous Southeast Asian group, and for them it's like a 50% don't get a high school diploma, and so there's a lot of nuance to, let's say, as far as education. I remember applying and looking at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor's application, and this was during the time when affirmative action was still being decided on a ballot just before then. And I remember seeing that there was a quota for 8% for Asian, and I don't remember if they counted South Asian with East Asian and Southeast Asian. I think it was just all as Asian. But at the time, I remember thinking, well, one, I questioned, does that mean if I disclose that I'm Asian in my application, do I get put into this pool, and then I'm competing against, and this is where I think this iteration of model minority, but also, this system applies for how, again, when I talk about like anti-Blackness in terms of a systems point of view, that it's applied in other dimensions too. Like, what about Chinese immigrants who have been established here, or Japanese immigrants who've been established here, or maybe they're not really immigrants anymore, they've been kind of naturalized, and there's kind of a different wealth base that comes with some of those communities, especially for those who haven't been from a diasporic context. And even among the Vietnamese American community, there were like 3 waves of exodus after the Vietnam War. So the first one were people who were most immediately affected by the change of regime and escaping, because of political persecution or whatever else. The second would be people who were able to escape hard labor camps and imprisonment, or they finished their term or whatever, and they were able to get out. And then the third is typically more affluent, and often from kind of an integrated communist North Vietnamese, no longer North Vietnamese, but just Democratic Republic of Vietnam group, and there's a different wealth dynamic there. So in that level, there are also dynamics of wealth and maybe advantage or privilege that comes from within just one. I'm speaking here to Vietnamese, but looking in the broader scope of Chinese, Indian, and other groups that are hailed as model minorities, that it's used as a blanket term. And again, I think one of the themes that I feel like really leaning on it is just anti-Blackness is a form of silencing in terms of how we exist, regardless of who we are. That there are a lot of mechanisms in place that make that so, and often when we don't have the capacity or curiosity to really listen and understand what isn't being said or what isn't being seen, that's when it becomes most violent.
Thank you. All right, so I want to shout out the chat. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Marnese Live Talk Show. Hi, Jesse. Hi, Diamond. Hi, Jennifer. So I have a question coming from Jennifer. She said it's been in the news that COVID-19 has fueled anti-Asian racism and xenophobia worldwide. Have any of the panelists experienced or been exposed to racial attacks against Asians and people of Asian descent since the pandemic? How does or doesn't the racism have similarities with anti-Blackness? Nobody experienced anything?
I think South Asians are kind of excluded from this racism because we don't look East Asian, because Asian is not a monolith. So I think it doesn't affect South Asians as much as it does East Asians. I think Ian would probably be able to speak to this more than I can.
Yeah, I felt all eyes kind of come to me as soon as you asked that. I was like, okay, I got to think about this.
So I'm like, don't do that.
Well, as so in all reality, I really where I'm staying right now, there's an elder as well that I'm sharing, and so I've really been kind of staying on the down low. But online, I definitely see that, and and even within the community, like my dad will gladly call it the Chinese virus, and even back then, and with I think the pandemic of 1918, that it was labeled the Spanish virus or the Spanish, uh, a political propagandist means, because the U.S. was also in conflict with Spain. It was the U.S. Spanish-American War at the time, and so those are subtle things where a lot of folks tend not to, within the family at least, they're just not cognizant of like asking where is this coming from, what does it mean, and how is it being actually used. Outside of that, definitely there's I remember seeing a woman. She was a journalist for I'm not sure if it's like, which is a very right extreme alt, uh, kind of like a Breitbart, and she would kind of place a similar assertion that it shouldn't be racist to call like if it's Chinese food, then it's Chinese food. Then if it's a virus, I don't remember exactly the metaphor that she used, but like if it's a virus from China, then why can't we call it something like that during a White House press meeting? So in that sense, if we're looking at community and kind of a shared identity kind of component, then I've seen that. I haven't personally run out and really encountered overt discrimination in that dimension. But when we look at anti-Blackness, words like entitled, lazy entitled, for example, that came out from Reconstruction era narratives, and kind of the carpetbaggers and all of that, and that language still persists today, right? It's kind of mutated a bit, and now that people apply it towards folks who talk about welfare and all these things, and even just the way where entitlements are things that people paid into. They earned it. They put in time and everything else. If you served in the military or whatever, you have certain entitlements, for example. But people gaslit, the public into thinking that, oh, it means being spoiled, right? And so I think you have the capacity to, one, examine and really anchor, where is this language coming from? What does it mean? And how is it being used? And by whom also? Who shapes these narratives? Because we can look at firms like Luntz Consulting or whatever it's called, the PR group that was famous for this climate memo and other things like the crafting the term the death tax, in the Obama administration era. It's basically one guy running a bunch of focus groups to find the best words for sensation, that would get media attention and whatever else. So in that dimension, anti-Blackness, and whether it's it comes from, I would say, like in injustice that comes from lack of specificity, accuracy, and so it's typically some sort of malicious.
All right, so I wanted to get everyone to give me your last
real quick point. Can I make a real quick point about the last topic?
Okay.
I think it's really interesting and important to recognize like the way that racism is in the United States fueled by the United States like geopolitical and geostrategic goals and desires for the world. So like 2011, we need a boogeyman, we need terrorism, Muslim people, Arab people. We're going to see a lot more anti-Asianness coming as the United States, as Obama called it, makes a pivot to Asia, and the United States begins to try and fight China in the South China Sea. We're going to see a lot more of this topic. And I think like in many ways, this conversation comes back to anti-Blackness because the United States has been at war with itself and the African-American community since, the very, very beginning. And I think like we see that around Black Lives Matter. We see that around relationships with the police, where we are this like internalized othered minority within the United States. Like we are the opposite pole, Black African diaspora people. And then I just, it's interesting like how in China, like that is like it's like the Han Chinese and then maybe the Hmong, and then like it's the the Uyghur, and then those are like the Tibetans, and it's like, and I don't know, I have a tough time. It's so weird because it's like Uyghurs and Tibetans are like what Black people is in the United States, and it's so disingenuous to see like Americans posting about it and not posting about anti-Blackness in the United States. And there's just all these layers in which the way like geopolitics and strategic racism play out. Just wanted to put that out there as a brief. I don't have like the answer, but it's just interesting to me.
Thank you. I wanted to get into more of the eraser of Blackness and how this term people of color is out here. And I wanted to get everyone's thoughts on that. So I wanted to go to Stephanie and Crystal and Amari first before we wrap up on people of color, grouping everybody together. To me, in my opinion, it's a form of anti-Blackness because it erases us. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I agree with you. I do believe it is a form of anti-Blackness. I remember first being exposed to it when I was working for the party, the state party, and I was the only person of color to represent the whole state. And they like pulled me into a room and were like, we need you to strategize and figure out how you're going to turn out people of color. And I was like, people of color, like, what do you mean, Black people? Like, can you define what you mean? And they just had this long list, and it was like everybody who was not white. And I was like, but do you think some of these people identify as people of color? Like, do you think this is actually a good term? So like in a organizing space, I've seen it be used as being like politically correct and mean everything outside of whiteness. But I have found it to be very problematic because when I'm organizing in my community with Black people, people of color is like, what do you mean? And often when I'm in spaces trying to engage Latinx or folks who are not white, calling them people of color has also been problematic, right? Like, oh, we're people of color. And they're like, am I? Am I a person of color? I am indigenous. I don't identify as a person of color. I identify as something else. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So for me personally, in my work, I would like to be able to say Black people, but when we are working in systems that are anti-Black, it can be problematic and triggering for some folks to be like, I'm demanding stuff for Black people. So it's just a really confusing term. Personally, I would rather be able to be explicit, but often I found in my work it to be an encompassing term for the party organizations to use to check mark that, oh, they're here. We put them all together, they're here, right? Like not acknowledging the diversity of folks, but by grouping us together, it makes it easier to check that mark. And it's like, that's not how it works. So.
Did you want to get in there?
Me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I agree with her. I feel like it's important to note that the phrase women of color, specifically women of color, comes from the Kembe River Collective of women writers from the mid-70s. And it was originally meant to be a term of solidarity. And I feel like so many other terms that we've coined for ourselves has been co-opted. And it does exactly what you just said that it does, is it lumps us all together. It makes it so that they don't have to be explicit in naming the oppressions, in naming the solutions, in taking ownership of the oppressions. So I'm really good, particularly in the classroom and even at work in the statements that are right, in saying Black people and non-Black people of color. Thank you. I understand that even that probably lumps everyone who's not Black or white. It's still very dichotomous. This is my daughter Kristen, and she is 4.
Hi.
And this is my son Bryson, and he is 8. You say hello. And they're excited because we have a fire going. Okay, thank you. Hi, okay, thank you. That's bye.
Hi, bye.
Yeah, so I'm talking about real serious, right? People, the phrase "people of color" and the origins of the words "women of color," and but yeah, I do believe it's been co-opted. I think it's a way, it's another cop out. It's another way to not have to say Black people, which in itself is anti-Black because they're afraid of Black, right? They fear having to say Black because then you have to acknowledge 400 plus years of atrocities. Then you have, it has weight. Black, to say Black has so much weight. And on my first day of class every semester, I have to tell students, you don't have to whisper it. It's not a curse word. It's not a 4-letter word. It's okay to say Black. You don't have to say people of color unless you mean people of color, right? Yeah, so I agree with everything that she just shared, and also.
Thank you, Crystal.
Yeah. So I agree with everything they said. And I think I want to add on that the strategy behind the people of color movement, it reminds me of something when I worked with Dr. Claude Anderson for a while. We studied some multicultural business districts. And in interviewing the owners of the districts, what they said is there were, in each of the districts, it was 3 or more different ethnicities. And what they said was all of the groups, including the Black folks, supported each other's businesses, except the Black businesses weren't supported by the other multicultural entities in the business district. So, and that's because everybody is complicit in anti-Blackness in America, including ourselves at times. But we're looked at as a consumer base of America. So everybody sees us, they see dollar signs. So what happens is they usurp and appropriate our culture and our buying power. And they put the brunt of America's racial issues on us. So they take the good out of it, and then they leave us sitting somewhere to deal with the issues on a mass level. It's very rare that multicultural groups support Black movement. What we're seeing over the last week has been beautiful because we are starting to see everybody's getting tired. You know, well, people from different groups are getting tired of this. So there's a demand on us, though, to be the strong America for Black folks. We have to be the strong. We have to take it all. We have to fix it all. And we have to be able to shut up and just buy. And to me, in moving in the university circuit and in the corporate America circuits that I move into, I find people of color is very strategically used.
Oh, yeah.
It's very strategically used by all groups.
Even nonprofit.
Right. Even, especially in nonprofit. The neoliberalism in nonprofit is such a huge barrier and progression that it's ridiculous. So I definitely don't like the term. It's not a term I really use. I have used it a couple times, but it's not a term. But what I will stop doing is using it for other people's comfort.
Exactly.
Yeah, because we deserve better and we need to demand better. And I've been guilty of it.
Thank you so much.
What do you guys think of the term Black Indigenous people of color? Like, I feel like I've seen that pop up more.
That's too much.
I tend to use BIPOC as a concept and term, but like, I don't know. Like, it seems that the United States wants to move away from the usage of the word minority. That's like, it seems to be the thing that they want. Like, how can we call all these other non-whites something else? I guess like at the heart of all this is like we're sitting here dancing around like how we should discuss and talk about ourselves, and like really like at the heart of the issue, the problem in America is like white identity politics and like white identity formation in the way that whiteness plays like an ethno-nationalist role in the United States, where you're not American if you're not white. Like whiteness is what it means to be American.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of institutions are being careful. They don't want to broadcast that they have evidence that Black people are indigenous to America and have been here for over 10,000 years. And they don't want to broadcast it, but they don't want to get caught not knowing. So they use terms like Black indigenous people of color.
I'm afraid I'll burn myself. Mom, can you help me?
I guess there's a polarity that I think about where on one hand, you know, the term like global majority or urban majority, and which, you know, I think that has a lot of merit depending on the context that we use that phrase. And at the same time, this one of the core things that I see is specificity being necessary to facilitate justice. And you know, being able to recognize that there's an identity and there's a priority. For example, you know, with Black Lives Matter, why are they saying Black Lives Matter? There's a priority for making sure that injustice is addressed through this kind of pressing lens and not just lens, reality, you know, and crisis that's underway. You know, like the question that comes up is how do you navigate that? And you know, I guess maybe it is a conversation and check in with the context kind of thing. But one of the things that I mentioned earlier was how challenging it is, where you know we're kind of, it feels like we're always playing into, not maybe we're not always, but like we're often stuck in kind of this framing, right? Because you know, even when we look to Africa, a lot of the people, there are different you know, expressions of melanation and genetic expressions, right? And so some of that is just inherent to who we are as human beings. And what terms would have come, you know, before colonization? I don't have the answers right now, but that's something that I guess is a question in terms of like, you know, are we part of? I think the term would be Al-Kebulani, right? Like folks who at one point in time or another came from Africa. You know, I don't have the words for it, and I think that's part of the problem as well.
Thank you, Ian. So I wanted to ask Stephanie, Amari, and Crystal, what are some suggestions that you can give non-Black people on how to unlearn, undo, and relearn just how not to be anti-Black? Like, how can they undo these behaviors, and how can these different communities show up for Black people? I hear this question a lot, and you know, email overload saying that you're in solidarity and all that. I just personally don't think that's enough. But what are some suggestions that you could provide, you know, other communities, white people, to how to show up for us and not to have you know, blackness behavior?
I think the first thing I would say is to acknowledge the fact that you are operating from a very white lens and white Euro-American training. So you're acting as an agent of a set of people that want to enact white supremacy, right? White supremacy is an oxymoron word, but people act in agency of it. And I think it was I'm not sure, somebody earlier mentioned the having to fit in to white America as a new ethnic group. So I think that you have to want a divorce. You have to acknowledge that you're operating from that very white homogenous lens, and upon acknowledging it, accept the task consciously, verbally, and in writing to yourself that you're going to make a move out of that mindset. Now, there are a bunch of tools. There are anti-racism workshops all around the country. There's a plethora of information that will allow you to educate yourself to not just Black history, but the Black experience throughout history, just in general in America. there's a great book by Robin DiAngelo, who's a professor in the Seattle area, I believe, called White Fragility. The crazy thing is white fragility applies to most non-black groups in America as with their interaction with black people specifically. So I think that's an excellent tool. It's a wonderful book. I think everybody, black, white, or any group, really should read it. But I think you should accept the task consciously, and you shouldn't accept less from your friends either.
Thank you. Stephanie, Crystal.
So I'm with Omari. Oh, go ahead. I can wait.
Crystal.
Okay. So I'm with Omari in the idea that there's really no excuse because the internet is at your fingertips. Even those areas that don't have a whole lot of broadband access have libraries that allow you to access the internet. There are reading lists, there are syllabi, there are YouTube videos, there are Netflix specials, there are mainstream television specials now, there are documentaries, there are firsthand interviews that you can read at the library. Do not expect your Black friends or colleagues to do that intellectual labor or that emotional labor for you. So that will be my first tidbit for those who want to become anti-racist and to unlearn their anti-Black ways. Go out and learn and shut up and listen sometimes, right? And don't expect your Black folks and your Black friends to do it for you. I think I would encourage them to ask questions because a lot of times, particularly when dealing with my college students, they don't know what they don't know, and you don't know unless you ask. So while I won't do the reading or the research for you, you can ask initiating questions that can send you on quests that will open your entire brain and will open your entire lived experience. We didn't really get into microaggressions. We didn't have time to get into microaggressions today. But the more that you learn,
follow-up topic.
That's a whole, right, it's a whole show. That could be a whole show on its own. But I think that's one of the ways the anti-Blackness manifests itself in our everyday interactions. And so I would encourage those folks who are not Black folks, even Black folks do it, to be mindful of your microaggressions. Be mindful of the things that you say and the way that you interact with people so that you are not doing harm.
You're so articulate.
Man, well, thank you. I appreciate that, but that's certainly a microaggression, and I have like 15 mosquito bites just this week from that same compliment. Because then you got to think about in comparison to what or who, right? According to whose standard.
Right.
And usually all you can say is, oh, okay, thanks. And I say, English is my first language. That's what I tell people when they say that. English is my first language. So hopefully it'll make them rethink their own assumption that I would not be able to be articulate, that I would not have a vocabulary, that I would not. I'm a standard. I got a dozen friends that are just like me. Well-read, well-educated, well-thought. And I got a dozen friends that's just as ratchet as they want to be. And they can read you just as quickly and just as easily for your anti-Blackness. So educate yourself. Don't put the labor on your Black friends. Ask questions.
I have a follow-up question for you. You said don't put the labor on your colleagues. What if colleagues are charged to actually do this work? Should they be compensated extra?
Yes. I don't know about extra, but if it's their job, let them do their job. Sure. Pay them.
Hazard.
It has to come in the house.
There should be a hazard pay.
Certainly hazard pay, right?
We are exhausted enough with dealing with receiving the aggressions and having to process them and manage them. So to have to educate others and assist them in processing it and learning it is just asking too much of us. And if you're doing it for a profession, then you should get paid very damn well as a Black person to deal with that.
If you're a diversity trainer, if you are teaching race in a collegiate setting or a high school setting, if you're a therapist or something, like if it's your job, that's different. That's different than the people around the water cooler asking you to explain, George Floyd. Or that's different than the people around the water cooler waiting for your perspective or expecting you to explain the historical ramifications of whatever current event, police violence or, rebellions and whatever. the internet is free. Google is free and it won't judge you.
Thank you, Crystal. All right, and Stephanie, as we wrap up the show.
I would say I agree with both reflection. It takes a lot of reflection for us to unlearn our implicit bias. The explicit, more than likely, we've been checked or someone addressed us for that behavior. But a lot of that bias has been passed down to us by our elders that was shared earlier. A lot of those stories and narratives of their lived experiences of how they were mistreated by a certain group, like that is actually the stuff we have to unlearn. And before you want to show up and take up space using your privilege in Black spaces, you need to unpack and unlearn. And that is even in the place of protesting. Unless you're trying to risk your body and be a white buffer between police and Black people, if you haven't unpacked your own privilege and your specific positionality, I would say don't show up. It can be more problematic to show up and you divert the intent of this action because you are wearing your blinders on, as Omari shared earlier, like your own existence and where you sit uniquely. And so as someone who's had to organize and do these events and do all this stuff, it's just like, I appreciate that you want to save us, but I don't appreciate you not acknowledging your unique position in this space before you enter it. And I definitely agree with Crystal that it's not Black people's emotional, we're not supposed to have to teach you how to be less racist, okay? It's really not our responsibility. Some of us may take that charge because we're tired, right? And we're tired of seeing well-intended people offending our people. But at the same time, that's a lot of self-reflection. And I would say for every hour of activism that you want to do to advocate for people of color, it's going to involve 10 to 15 hours of unpacking your implicit bias.
I love that.
And I feel like that's the math that a lot of people don't consider. They just think, oh, this is wrong. I want to show up. I want to grab my poster. I want to be out here. But if you still let Granny slide when she says something offensive to your great-grandkids because they biracial, and you just let that slide, you shouldn't be out here protesting. You need to address your family. You need to address your friends and your safe spaces when you are surrounded by nothing but white people and they make those jokes and they make those comments because they're like, no person of color is here to hear me. That is where I need you personally. Okay, I don't necessarily need you coming into Black spaces, taking up space, and you haven't even addressed the issues that happen in safe white spaces by white people. And so for me, I would say that's where I would leave it.
That's the word. And I just want to add a professor from UC Berkeley, who I see every year at a conference, Dr. Vivian Francis, or Francis Vivian, I can never remember. But she said, as a white woman that teaches white privilege work, she said she has white friends that ask her, what can they do for the Blacks? And she said, the Black folks are very capable. All we have to do is collectively stay out of their way.
Thank you. All right, so I want to get to Suwaita, Antonio, Maruba, and Ian. What are some action steps that you could provide people from your culture on how not to be anti-Black, right? What are some tactics or suggestions you can provide people coming from your culture who are listening in? You know, what things have you done? Like, for example, Maruba, you had conversations with your family. Like, how do you get this conversation going? Suwaita, how do you get this conversation going? And how do you call your family, friends in your culture out, but then call them in? How you keep this conversation going? Suwaita, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Marnese. It's definitely not easy, but I think you just got to do it. And I've been doing it for a really long time now, and it started out with a lot of really hard conversations where me and my family member would both end up crying, or we'd both end up shouting at each other. And you just have to put yourself through that if you want to if you want if you want your community to be anti-Black, anti-racist, like, you need to go through that with your family and with your community. But I would say there's a lot of resources on the internet out there to help you guide those conversations. And obviously, before you do all of this, like everyone else said, make sure that you do your reading, make sure that you unlearn your own anti-Blackness first.
Thank you so much. Maruba.
And
oh, you're on mute, hon.
Sorry. I'm going to add to what Swetha is saying. Basically, it is a lot of uncomfortable conversations with the people, your closest circle, right? Not just about just posting on social media and making sure your friends list knows that you're anti-Black, right? It's making sure that people within your immediate circle understand what it is, what the concept of anti-Blackness is, and how they can be better allies. You can't be an ally if you don't understand the root cause of issues, or if you don't understand the issues themselves. And I had to start at the very beginning with my own, with my own mom, kind of sit down with her, explain to her from the very conception of this country, how it all began, and then walking her through history and walking her through how it's just added, over the last couple hundred years, and how we are, the place we are at now, and how this has all come together to create all these systemic issues, and it's been a lot of uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable dialogue. It took me about, I want to say, a good decade to get my mom to where she is now, where she understands and she acknowledges that we as South Asians have our privileges as well. So, I mean, you just got to start somewhere. I definitely say call out people within your social circles, direct social circles, have those uncomfortable conversations to begin with. Don't be okay with even those microaggressive comments that people make, those very broad brush comments that people make, that people from the Black community are uneducated or not well versed or not, and then all the list of nots, right? And that's the first step, I would say.
Thank you so much. And before we go, could you tell us some tactics or action steps people can take coming from your community?
So it's challenging. I empathize with, my dad's a Trump supporter, or he was for a time. And so the things that I found was that, one, recognizing that often the things that appeal are it's more on an emotional level, and trying to seek that there's understanding or something that you're starting with. And then second, when it comes to, it's sort of a mix, right? Like, again, I look at personal stories. Second is kind of the definitions or measures or policies or things that you can kind of verify. And then third is being able to highlight like some of the systemic, things that maybe he can relate to or see. So one thing I've noticed is if you pay attention to Fox News, they often speak about fair and balanced. And so they'll provide two, contrasting views, even though one might be completely weighted differently, and take it out of context. But those are things that, for better or worse, that a lot of, I think, the folks like my dad have kind of been tuned to looking into, is one, that sense of balance, even if it actually isn't, and then being able to speak where they're at, meeting people where they're at, right? And then the second part is when it comes to just the reality, like for me, I sometimes have to really discipline myself to like calm down, be able to approach from a place of calm. Otherwise, the stuff that's the fight that's in there gets heard, and he already shuts down, and you're not able to persuade in that manner. So try to find opportunities that you can engage from a creative direction, whether you're cooking, and build from there. And these are it's really about like how to talk to someone. It's not so much about how to talk about Blackness and anti-Blackness, but that is kind of typically the first barrier that I run into. So I think that might be helpful for a lot of people who who are advocating and just trying to get that conversation going in spaces that normally might just have no conception whatsoever. Your presence is already in your presence is already a way of changing that.
Thank you, Ian. All right, Antonio, bring us home.
Yeah, so I think this really is definitely a role that non-Black people of color, whatever, non-Black people can play is engaging in this. I have a coworker named Tiffany, and I have so much respect for her because she just like refuses to engage in a lot of these conversations that happen within the place that we work, the National Wildlife Federation. And when I first got the job, I was like, man, I'm not going to bother with a lot of those like justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. I'm going to focus on my program, which is taking kids in Detroit outdoors, connecting them with nature. I'm going to like focus on that. And then this Puerto Rican woman, Elizabeth Ian Perez, she's like a mentor, amazing woman. She helped kind of like say, like, if you have been like privileged enough to grow up in a diverse community, a Black community, and you're educated, you're awake to what's happening in the world, and you're within an institution making money, you have a responsibility to like actually like work on these issues within your capacity. So like I'm happy that I'm hired in and I'm not like the only, so now there's 2 of us who are people of color, or 3 of us who are there. So now I can speak when I know Tiffany really doesn't want to, and she's really uncomfortable with it, and she has no, interest in engaging those conversations. And I don't mind saying like somewhat audastic things to the organization, telling them that like all conservation is rooted in colonialism and like it's inherently racist. I mean, these are hard conversations that I've been having, and I think as like healthy, cis, decently like light skinned, whatever person, like it's gonna be easier coming from me. It's just unfortunate in like again a measure of anti-Blackness in American society, but I think it's like we have to like step up in a lot of spaces. And like I think that as an organizer, Chicano, whatever, indigenous organizer in Detroit, like I'm more comfortable around like non-white people. Like I'd prefer like that's where I spend most of my time. But it like just as much as I say white people, you need to go to the suburbs, I need to spend some time in the suburbs too. Like finding these pockets of people and like not deleting friends who are assholes on Facebook, because like slowly over the years, you might be able to influence these people. And like anytime you go into one of these communities, I think one of the most important things that you can do is speak to people's values. Some like white men are super moved by facts and details. Some people are moved by stories and examples. Some people are moved by direct relationships and like bringing people together and like cooking and doing stuff. But a lot of the primary reasons that I think racism will continue to be a major, major issue in America is the disconnection. Is like this, like especially in Metro Detroit, like this is the most segregated metropolitan area in the entire country. So like when people are no longer, and then there's also like the segregation of ideas that happens in social media. So like people are like relegated to the suburbs, relegated to their little like white nationalist shit on Facebook. They're like inundated with this sort of media all day long. So it's really, really difficult to then be a person trying to enter this person's weird fucking bubble and trying to like, insert ideas. But I think like short, strong, powerful ideas that plant seeds that will undermine, people's like belief systems, I think is like something that I've found successful with a number of people I like say went to high school with. I went to a high school that was like majority white, and like some of these like white people who have hung on and not deleted me as a friend over the years have really like reached out or like, regretted the way that things were in high school. Like I've seen people change over time with like so much information, so much exposure to X, Y, and Z, but it's really about like planting really pithy, powerful seeds that speak deep truths about like the fucked up, fractured nation of where America came from. But I think it's like really just popping people's American bubble, people's like American dream bubble. I think a lot of people exist in places where like they have decent schools, and the police are out there to protect and serve, or whatever the fuck it is. So like, they see the world and expect everybody has come from the same circumstances that they have. So it's like, I don't know. It's difficult to pop that bubble, but I think there's ways to like do it in like powerful short, because like you're never gonna get somebody's like 6 hours of somebody's time where you can go through the entire history of how Detroit became like this segregated, stratified, and like all the policies and rules that the government redlining. It's like I do that in workshops with people, and I do that in workshops with white people as well. But like most of the time you're not gonna get that opportunity. So like, you have to find ways to like meet audiences where they are and speak to and provide information and data that speaks to their values and also like undermines some of their deep-seated belief systems. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Antonio. So I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on my talk show to talk about this. There will be a follow-up conversation about this, and of course I would love for you all to come on and be a part of this conversation so we can dig deeper, right? These conversations got to keep happening. We have to, I mean, it is exhausting talking about racism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy. However, we just got to do it. And so once again, I want to say thank you all for coming on and staying on and just being patient. I love having you all on the show. So I look forward to organizing with you all, and of course, communicating. So thank you all for coming on.
Thank you, Marnese.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Marnese.
Thanks. Great meeting all of
Thank you,
also.
Marnese.
Good meeting you all.
Thanks, Marnese.
Yeah, nice chatting with y'all. Good night.
All right. So thank you so much for coming on to the Marnese Live Talk Show. We had a wonderful conversation. Of course, we're going to keep talking about this because we have to dismantle white supremacy and racism, and we have to just keep talking about this. We have to de-silo these conversations. So I wanted to definitely give a shout out to our Black businesses. Shout out to Rose Spit, Burn Rubber. You can purchase sneakers in World Oak, Michigan. He has an online store, burnrubbersneakers.com. Reach out and support Roland and our Black businesses. Also, if you're interested in more fashion, talking about sneakers, pop culture, and if you have questions, tune into the Friends and Brands podcast live, and you can follow Nick and Mark on YouTube. So on next week, we will be talking about colorism. We have a full panel of guests, and we would dive deep more into anti-Blackness and how colorism shows up in the Black communities and other non-Black people of color communities. So tune in to the Marnese Live Talk Show on next week, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so I would like to thank you so much for supporting me and watching the Marnese Live Talk Show, especially tonight as we stayed on a little bit longer. You can follow me on Facebook at Marnese Live Talk Show, on Instagram at Marnese Live Talk Show, and on YouTube at the Marnese Live Talk Show. Thank you, and have a wonderful night.